December 24th, 1944. Somewhere in eastern France. The war paused just long enough for the snow to look beautiful. The village was little more than a crossroads, a dozen stone houses, a frozen fountain, and a church whose bell tower had lost its top to an artillery shell. The roof was patched with tarps. One stained glass window was boarded up, but the doors still worked. U.S. Army Chaplain James Carter stood just inside those doors, fingers numb around a worn leather Bible, listening to the murmur of men filing into the pews. They looked wrong in a church. Mud-streaked boots. Greatcoats still dusted with frost. Helmets pushed back, faces lined with more than just fatigue. Some crossed themselves. Some stared at the floor. Some just came for the promise of warmth and an hour off duty. Outside chain CLINKED. Not heavy chains. Not prison chains. Just the light rattle of metal on metal, the sound of dog tags and canteen clips as another column moved. Down the road. German prisoners of war. Carter glanced. Through the cracked doorway. They came two by two under the watchful eyes of American guards. Gray coats. Wool caps instead of helmets. Some limping. Some carrying others. A few looked up as they passed the church, eyes catching on the flicker of candlelight inside. They slowed. For a heartbeat. The whole column seemed to waver. One young German at the edge of the formation, no more than 20, dark hair. Hollow cheeks, stared at the carved cross above the door as if he'd seen a ghost from his own childhood. Behind him, an MP barked, "Keep moving." They did, boots crunching on snow. Breath steaming in the cold. Carter felt his stomach twist. It was Christmas Eve. The carols waiting inside spoke of peace on earth and goodwill toward men. But 10 yards away marched men his flock simply called Krauts, most of whom would spend the night in a barbed-wire pen on the edge of town. He looked at the Bible in his hand, then back at the column. And an idea so ridiculous, so dangerous, came to him that he almost laughed. Instead, he stepped out into the snow. "Lieutenant." He called to the nearest MP officer, voice carrying over the crunch of boots. "Hold them a minute." Germans stopped. Americans frowned. The young prisoner at the edge looked from the chaplain to the church doors, confusion burning through his exhaustion, because what the American was about to do next was something none of them were prepared for. To understand why that moment mattered, you have to go back before the snow, before the candles, before the stunned faces and gray wool. Back to the way the war had taught men to see each other. For 2 years, James Carter's world had been defined by uniforms and distances. How far to the front line? How long to the next artillery barrage? How many miles between a frightened 19-year-old and the mother who'd kissed his forehead before he boarded a train? He'd marched with infantry through the hedgerows of Normandy, listened to confessions in muddy foxholes, buried boys beneath makeshift crosses, hammered into foreign soil. He'd watched men who'd never been farther from home than the next county stare at their first dead German as if he were a monster from a storybook. The war made it easy. The posters back home showed cartoon Huns with claws and fangs. Newsreels spoke of atrocities. Chaplains like Carter heard the whispered hatred after every costly engagement. They didn't surrender. They shot at medics. They killed my buddy when he was trying to give up. On the other side, German soldiers heard their own version. America, they were told, was decadent, materialistic, a land of jazz, greed, and chaos. Its soldiers would show no mercy to prisoners. Its bombs were destroying cities. Its people wanted nothing less than to grind Germany into dust. In that world, POW camps were less about humanity and more about logistics. You disarm them. You search them. You put them behind wire. You fed them enough to keep them working, not enough to make them forget they'd lost. You did not invite them into your church. Church was where the Americans went to remember home, to hear hymns from their childhood, to tell themselves, if only for an hour, that they were more than rifles and rations and marching orders. It was where Carter tried to stitch together the torn edges of their souls. He'd seen what battle did to belief. Some clung harder to their faith with every incoming shell. Some threw it away after seeing a friend die in their arms. Some never spoke the word God again unless it was as a curse. To them, the Germans outside the wire weren't just enemies. They were almost symbols, evidence of everything that had gone wrong since 1939, proof that evil wore a field gray uniform and spoke with a harsh accent. Then the war shifted. Autumn brought the Germans' last desperate counterattacks. Winter slammed down. Towns changed hands twice in a week. Columns of prisoners, once unthinkable, became common. They started arriving in droves. Some were hardcore believers in the Reich, eyes still burning with fanatic light. Some were old men with frostbitten fingers and no love left for the leaders who'd ordered them into the meat grinder. Some were boys barely out of school, terrified and bewildered. They were marched past churches and chapels all over Europe, and almost everywhere. The doors stayed shut. It wasn't personal. It was policy. It was habit. It was the world as everyone understood it. Your God, their God, you're wounded. They're wounded. Your sorrow, their problem. On Christmas Eve of 1944, in a village whose name barely appeared on a map, that understanding was about to be challenged. Not by a general with a new directive, not by a politician with a speech, but by one chaplain, one column of POWs, and a simple question that wouldn't leave him alone. If peace on earth didn't include the men behind the wire, what was it worth? The thought had been gnawing at James Carter all afternoon. Even before he saw the Germans in the snow, he'd spent the day turning a battered sanctuary into something that looked, if you squinted, like Christmas. The altar cloth was a borrowed white bedsheet. The candles came from a farmhouse cellar. There was no choir, only a handful of men who could more or less carry a tune and remembered the words to Silent Night. He'd walked up and down the aisles, laying out mimeographed hymn sheets on the benches, listening to the wind moan through holes in the roof. Everywhere he went, the same phrases from the gospel for that night followed him around like ghosts. Peace on earth, to all people of good will. He'd paused once, at a broken stained glass window where shards of blue and red still clung to the lid. The missing panel had once shown shepherds kneeling before an angel. Now it showed a temporary patch of plywood and war-blackened stone. He'd put his hand on the cold sill and whispered into the empty church, "All people, Lord? Does that include the ones trying to kill us?" There was no thunderbolt answer, just the distant rumble of artillery and the soft creak of old wood. By dusk, the first Americans had begun to drift in. A few carried letters from home folded into shirt pockets. One had tucked a small stuffed bear into his helmet band. Another clutched a harmonica like a talisman. Carter greeted them at the door with a tired smile. "Merry Christmas, Corporal. Glad you made it." "Private." They nodded, some awkwardly, some with genuine warmth. Men filed into pews. Helmets came off. For a moment, with the candles lit and the murmur of voices rising, the war outside seemed to fade. Then the column appeared. He heard them before he saw them. Boots in the snow. The clipped bark of German words. The slower cadence of marchers not fully in step. He stepped to the doorway, curiosity tugging him forward. The sight hit him in the chest. 100 Germans, maybe more, moving past under guard. Some with bandaged arms, some with makeshift slings. One man with a scarf tied over a missing eye. They were bundled against the cold in mix-and-match clothing, army coats, Civilian sweaters, old blankets. They weren't roaring fanatics from the newsreels. They were just men. Tired, thin, streaked with the same mud and soot as the Americans inside. Their eyes flicked toward the church doors, toward the flicker of candlelight and the faint strains of organ music. Young man at the edge of the formation caught Carter's eye. He had an angular face that might have been handsome before hunger hollowed it out. His lips moved, too soft to hear, forming a word in German as he looked at the cross. Kirche, maybe. Church, or a name. Or a prayer. The MP lieutenant marching beside the column signaled to his men. Keep it tight, boys. No stragglers. They were almost past when Carter moved. He stepped out into the snow, boots crunching, and raised his free hand. Lieutenant, he called. One moment. The MP officer turned, clearly annoyed. He was young, with a jaw that looked permanently clenched. Chaplain, sir, I've got orders to get these prisoners to the pen before dark, he said. Command doesn't want them milling around the village. I know, Carter said. This won't take long. He glanced back at the church. He could feel the eyes of his own men on his back through the cracked door. They'd seen the Germans. They knew who he was talking to. Sometimes, he thought, you don't get to rehearse your sermons. You just have to live them. He stepped closer to the lieutenant, lowering his voice. I want to invite some of them inside, he said. The words felt absurd even as he spoke them, like a line from a story he'd heard as a boy about saints and enemies and miracles. The lieutenant blinked. Come again? For the service, Carter said. It's Christmas Eve. The lieutenant let out a short, humorless laugh. With respect, sir, I think the boys inside would lose their minds if they turned around and saw Krauts in the pews. Not armed. Under guard, Carter said quickly. 10 of them. 20, maybe. The ones who want to. We sit them up front where everyone can see them. So we can watch our guys kill them? The lieutenant snapped. There it was. The raw edge under all the formalities. A few months ago, the same lieutenant had ridden in a jeep that hit a mine. He'd watched a friend die in the seat next to him. The shrapnel had come from a German shell. Look, he said, lowering his voice. These men in my column? They were shooting at us 2 days ago. You want me to what? Let him join in a sing-along? Carter stared at the snow-covered boots, at the frost on the prisoner's eyelashes, at the church doors behind him. This isn't about singing, he said. It's about not pretending that our God draws the same line the barbed wire does. The lieutenant swore under his breath. Behind him, the column shifted uneasily. The young German at the edge, name unknown, passed a mystery look from one officer to the other, trying to read what was being said. He understood none of the words, but he understood the way the chaplain pointed at the church, then at the prisoners, then placed a hand over his heart. For 2 years, his world had been trenches and discipline and orders shouted by men in field gray. Back home, before any of this, he'd sung Silent Night in a small village church not so different from this one. Could such a thing be possible here? The lieutenant saw the faces, fear, curiosity, hopelessness warring with something incredibly fragile. Hope, he swore again, less vehemently. What if this goes sideways, Chaplain? He asked quietly. What if one of them does something stupid? What if one of ours does? Then I'll be standing between them, Carter said. He meant it. The lieutenant looked into his eyes and saw he meant it. He blew out a breath that plumed white in the cold. 10, he said. You pick them. They go in unarmed. My men stay by the door. One wrong move, it's over. And Chaplain, this is on you. I understand, Carter said. He turned to the column. The young German at the edge watched, heart pounding. Because in the next few seconds, Someone would decide whether his war included a church door that finally opened, or stayed locked forever. The process of choosing who went inside could have been clinical. Numbers. Every 10th. Man. Random. At WA send single quotes T. Carter stepped toward the column, boots slipping slightly on packed snow. The cold bit at his ears. The MP guards watched him like he was walking a tightrope over a minefield. He looked at the faces, up close. They were younger than they'd seemed from the doorway. One had a wispy mustache trying and failing to make him look older. Another clutched a worn photograph in a gloved hand, a woman and 2 children, edges creased from constant folding. A third had fingers stained with oil and soot, the mark of a mechanic or some kind of technician. He didn't see monsters. He saw boys who could have been in his own youth group back in Ohio. He raised his hands in what he hoped was a non-threatening gesture, and tried a few words of broken German. Church, he said, pointing behind him. Christmas. He mimed praying, then spread his arms as if to say, "You?" They stared at him. Some looked away quickly, like men flinching from a blow they thought was coming. Others narrowed their eyes, suspicion sharpening their features. Was this a trick? A test of loyalty? An American trap to mock them? The young man at the edge, Franz Meyer, though no one here knew his name, yet swallowed. He understood every word. 3 semesters of theology at a small university in Munich before the draft had filled his head with Greek verbs and church. Latin. English had been second on the list. He'd paid attention. Now those lessons rose from the back of his mind. Christmas service, he translated for the man next to him in a low voice. He asks if we want to go inside. The older soldier beside him snorted. For what? So they can show their mercy to the cameras? So their God can watch us? Franz hesitated. He thought of the last time he'd been in a church. That wasn't just a place to stack ammunition. Before the war. Before uniforms. Before the sermons that sounded less like the gospel and more like speeches about destiny and blood. He thought of his mother's voice, soft and clear, singing, "Oh, you happy one." On Christmas Eve. The chaplain was still waiting. Handout. An MP shifted. Rifle strap creaking. Franz realized his hand was already moving. "I will go," he said. The English clumsy but understandable. The words startled him as much as anyone else. The MP at his elbow stiffened. Hey, what did he say?" "He volunteered," Carter answered, surprised at the sudden surge of emotion in his chest. He nodded at Franz and gestured toward the church. "Slowly," he said. Slow. One by one, 9 more stepped forward. A boy who couldn't have been older than 16, still with the softness of adolescence round his jaw. A man with a metal ribbon on his tunic but eyes that looked hollowed out. An older soldier with graying hair who took off his cap as he moved, reverence ingrained in the gesture. The lieutenant counted them, jaw tight. "That's 10, he said. "Guns up, but fingers off the triggers." The guards shifted formation. 2 at the front, 2 at the back, 2 by the church doors. As they walked, the other prisoners watched. Some with envy, some with contempt. One spat in the snow. "Traitor," he muttered. "Traitors." Franz heard it. The word stung, but the pull of the open door was stronger. Inside, the sanctuary buzzed with low conversation. The Americans filling the pews turned as the group entered. Silence fell like a dropped curtain. It wasn't dramatic. It was worse. A heavy, clotted silence, full of sharp breaths and stiffening shoulders. Steel helmets swiveled. Hands tightened on knees. Eyes narrowed. You could feel the room asking the same question. What are they doing here? The organist, an old Frenchman in a threadbare coat, hesitated over the keys. Carter felt the tension hit him like a physical wave. He walked quickly to the front. intercepting the Germans before they reached the first pews. He turned to face his own men. "All right, listen up," he said, raising his voice just enough to carry. "We've got some guests tonight." A murmur rippled through the crowd. "Guests?" someone echoed, incredulous. Carter nodded. "They're unarmed," he said. "They're under guard, and they're going to sit up front, where we can see them, where they can see us." He let that sink in. He saw faces flush with anger, others with confusion, a few with something like reluctant curiosity. He saw Sergeant Miller in the third row, the scar on his jaw pale against his skin. Miller, whose brother's last letter had arrived the same week a telegram announced his death in the Hurtgen forest. Miller's eyes were on the Germans, hard as flint. "They killed Danny," someone whispered near him. Carter took a breath. "You don't have to like this," he said. "Some of you won't, some of you can't. I get that." He glanced at the Germans behind him. They stood stiffly, not understanding the words but feeling the sharp edge in the air. "But I'm going to remind you what night it is," he continued. "What we're about to sing, what we're about to pray." He lifted his Bible. "Either we mean the words we're about to say, or we don't," he said simply. It wasn't a debate-ending argument. It was just all he had. He turned to the Germans and pointed to the front pews. "Here," he said in German. "Sit down." They moved slowly, shuffling into one side of the front row. MPs positioned themselves at the aisle ends, rifles slung, hands ready. Franz sat at the far left, closest to the altar. From there, he could see everything. Cracked fresco of an angel on the ceiling, the candles flickering on the makeshift altar. The faces of 100 American soldiers trying to decide whether this was an outrage or a miracle. He swallowed. His heart pounded so loudly he could barely hear the organist begin the first hymn. Because the real test hadn't started yet. That would come when voices joined, or refused to. When anger met scripture, when memories of friends lost met the sight of former enemies kneeling in the same light, and when one chaplain had to somehow hold the whole fragile thing together with nothing but words. The first notes of Silent Night drifted up, thin and uncertain. The old French organist's fingers trembled on the keys. The instrument wheezed like an asthmatic giant, piped slightly out of tune from shrapnel damage. But the melody was unmistakable. Silent night. Holy night. Carter heard his own voice join in, rougher than he remembered it. Around him, the Americans picked it up. Some sang from habit, the words tucked into their bones since childhood. Others mouthed along, eyes on the floor, lost in their own thoughts. Franz sat in the front pew, the sound washing over him. He knew this hymn. Every German did. Silent night, holy night. The syllables rose in his mind, automatic, like a reflex, but he didn't sing. Not yet. He felt the weight of eyes on the back of his neck, the press of MPs at either end of the pew, the hostility radiating from some of the men behind him. He kept his gaze fixed on the candle, flame on the altar. Halfway through the first verse, something shifted. A second melody floated in, softer at first, then strengthening. German. Not from the prisoners' bench. From behind them. Franz's head turned of its own accord. An American sergeant 2 rows back was singing in heavily accented German. Eyes closed. Still nart. Heilig Nacht, alles schulgt, einsam wackt. His voice was steady. His face unreadable. Franz stared. The man opened one eye, caught Franz's look, and gave the tiniest shrug. "College choir," he muttered between lines. "Learned the German version for fun." Then he went back to singing. Something in Franz's chest cracked. His own voice slipped out, almost without permission. "Only the faithful holy couple?" The syllables felt like coming home. Beside him, the older soldier with the gray-flecked hair joined in, bass low and rough. At the other end of the pew, the 16-year-old's lips moved silently. Too choked to make sound, the organ carried them all. German and English verses weaving in and out of each other like threads in a tapestry, for a moment. The labels blurred. Not Americans and Germans, not victors and defeated, just voices, clinging to the same fragile hope in different tongues, until the third verse, Son of God, love's pure light. That was when it happened. The pew creaked as someone stood abruptly. The hymn faltered. Carter looked up from his hymnal. Sergeant Miller stood in the third row, fists clenched at his sides. His jaw worked as if he were chewing on words he didn't want to spit out. His gaze burned holes in the back of the front pew. Right where the German sat, he took a step into the aisle. Conversation died. The organist's hands froze on the keys. Miller's voice cracked the silence. "This is wrong," he said hoarsely. "Sir." He tacked the last word on late. Out of habit more than respect. Every head turned. Carter felt his stomach knot. "Sergeant," he said carefully. "Now's not. They killed Danny," Miller said, voice rising. "They shelled his position until there was nothing left. Not even enough to bury proper." His eyes shone. Whether from fury or grief, it was hard to tell. "And now they sit up front?" He continued. "They get candles and carols while he's in a hole in the Hurtgen forest?" He pointed a shaking hand toward the German. "Bench. They don't belong here." The words hung stark in the air. Franz understood enough English to grasp the tea. Meaning, he remained very still. His heart hammered against his ribs hard. Enough to hurt. The MPs shifted. Hands resting on their rifle stocks, waiting. Carter stepped down from the chancel, every eye tracking him. He walked slowly up the aisle until he was level with Miller, up close. The sergeant looked less like an avenging angel and more like a man barely holding himself together. Stubble, red-rimmed eyes. A letter sticking out of his breast pocket like an accusation. "I know about Danny," Carter said quietly. "We all know. We buried his pack. We sent his mother the nicest letter we could write. We pray for him every night. Then why are they here?" Miller asked, jaw tight. He wasn't shouting now. He sounded desperate. Betrayed. Carter glanced at the Germans. Franz had lowered his head. The older man beside him stared straight ahead. Face carved from stone. The 16-year-old had tears tracking silently down his cheeks. Carter looked back at Miller. "Because if they aren't," he said. "We're lying?" Miller blinked. "Lying?" He repeated. Carter gestured vaguely at the altar, the crucifix, the hymn sheets. "About all of this," he said. "About what we say we believe. About what this night is supposed to mean." He took a breath. His next words weren't in any sermon notes. "You can walk out," he said. "Any of you can. I won't stop you. I won't judge you. God knows I don't have that right. What you've seen, what you've lost. I can't stand here and tell you you're wrong to feel what you feel." He stepped closer. "But I will tell you this," he continued softly. "If we can't let the men who are trying to kill us sit in a pew under the same roof for an hour, then the peace we say we're fighting for doesn't mean a damn thing once the shooting stops." Silence. Snow ticked against the boarded-up window like fingers. Somewhere near the back, someone sniffed. "If I tell them to leave," Carter went on, "we'll all feel better for a while. It'll feel right. It'll feel fair. But what happens tomorrow? And the day after? When more of them surrender? When this ends and they go back to what's left of their homes and we go back to ours?" He swallowed. "Do we want to carry a war in our hearts for the rest of our lives?" He asked. "Or do we want one night where we act like what we say in here has teeth?" Miller's eyes darted between him and the prisoners. The men in gray had no idea what was being said, but the intensity needed no translation. Franz's hands were clenched together, so tightly his knuckles were white, he thought. Not for the first time, that this might be the moment an American bullet found him without a trench or a foxhole to hide in. For a long time. No one moved. Then Miller's shoulders sagged out, his gaze dropped to the floor. "My brother," he whispered. "He never got a chance like this." Carter nodded slowly. "I know," he said. "Maybe that's why they should." Miller laughed once, a short, bitter sound that broke into a sob halfway through. He scrubbed it at his face with the back of his hand, anger collapsing into exhausted grief. "Fine," he muttered. "Let him sit." He dropped back into his pew, elbows on knees, head in his hands. No one clapped. No one shouted amen. The organist, not sure what else to do, gently laid his hands back on the keys. The hymn picked up again, shaky but determined. "Sleep in heavenly peace." This time, more voices joined. Carter walked back to the front, heart pounding. He turned to face the congregation. "Tonight's reading," he said, voice rough, "is from the Gospel of Luke." He opened the Bible. The pages felt heavier than they should have, and there were shepherds living out in the fields nearby, keeping watch over their flocks at night. As he read, Franz listened out. The cadence was different, the accent strange, but the story was familiar. Good news. Great joy. All people. He watched the Americans around him, men who might have killed him. Or he them, days earlier. Men with the same hollow eyes, the same twitch at loud noises, the same lines of strain around their mouths. Men who, for this small slice of time, weren't enemies. Just listeners. At one point, Carter paused. He closed the Bible and let it rest against the pulpit. "I don't know what any of you are going to face tomorrow," he said. "Some of you will go back to the line. Some of you won't. Some of you in gray will stay behind barbed wire for months, maybe years." He looked at the POW bench. Franz looked back, meeting his eyes. "But I hope," Carter said slowly, "that when you remember this night, you remember that for 1 hour in one ruined little church, the war had to wait outside." He let the words hang. Then he bowed his head. "Let's pray," he said. And for the first time in a long time, some of the men who'd almost given up on the idea did exactly that. An hour is nothing in the life of a war, on paper. That Christmas Eve service barely merited a footnote. No shots fired, no medals awarded, no ground taken or lost. But for the men who walked out of that church, something had shifted. The Germans left first. The lieutenant signaled to his MPs, who straightened, hands going automatically to rifle stocks. The prisoners rose slowly, stiff from the cold and the long sit. Franz's leg had gone numb. He stamped his boot discreetly to get the feeling back. As they turned to file out, he glanced down one of the side aisles. Miller sat there, hands clasped, head bowed. He lifted his gaze for a moment. Their eyes met. Franz braced for hatred. What he saw instead was something muddier. Pain, confusion, resentment. And buried inside all that, the barest hint of reluctant acknowledgement. Not forgiveness. That would have been too much to ask. Just recognition. You exist. You are human. You are no longer just the thing in my gun sight. Miller looked away quickly, as if startled by what he'd let himself feel. Outside, the snow had grown thicker. It muffled their footsteps as they crossed the square toward the waiting trucks. The POW enclosure waited at the far edge of town. Barbed wire, guard towers, floodlights that turned night into a harsh, artificial day. As they walked, the prisoners murmured among themselves. "What was that?" one asked. "A show? Propaganda?" another grunted. "They want us to think they are merciful." Franz shook his head. He could still hear the chaplain's voice in his ears. He didn't understand all the words, but he understood enough. "They didn't have to invite us," he said quietly. They didn't have to argue with their own men for us. The older soldier beside him grunted. Maybe they just wanted to show off their generosity. He muttered. Maybe, Franz said. But the candle still felt warm. It wasn't a theological argument, it was a sensory memory. Wax and smoke and that peculiar, comforting smell of a building where people had been praying for centuries. In the months that followed, the POW camp settled into its own kind of routine, roll call, work details, counted rations, mail sometimes, interrogations at first, then fewer as the front moved and interest shifted elsewhere. The Americans running the camp were not saints. There were guards who mocked, who shoved, who took out their own fear in small daily humiliations. But there were also men who slipped extra bread to those who looked especially thin, who tried out their high school German on board prisoners, who shared cigarettes over fences, and there was a chaplain who visited once a week. He didn't have to. His main duty was to the Americans' weddings by proxy, letters to grieving families, services for units about to ship back into combat. But he came anyway. Sometimes he held a short prayer in English, then offered to let anyone speak in their own language. Sometimes he just walked the perimeter, exchanging nods with men whose names he didn't know but whose faces he recognized from that front pew. Once, months later, he arrived with an odd cargo. Books. Paperbacks donated by churches back home. A few battered German volumes scavenged from abandoned houses with the owner's permission. A thin New Testament in Gothic script that made his eyes water when he tried to read it. He held that one up as he approached the fence. Wer von innen kann das noch lesen? He called in halting German. Who among you can still read this? A few hands went up. Franz's was one of them. He stepped forward. The chaplain smiled faintly. You were in the front row, he said slowly, picking out the words. In the church. At Christmas. Franz nodded. You? Sang in my language, he replied, equally slow. The chaplain shrugged. Your carol is pretty, he said. He passed the slim book through the wire. For when you want words and you don't have any of your own, he said. Franz took it carefully. The paper was thin. The ink faded. It felt heavier than his issued tin mess cup. Back in the barracks that night, men gathered around him as he opened it. He wasn't a pastor. Not yet. Not then. But the habit of reading aloud, of framing stories, was already in him. He started with the Nativity, because of course he did. As he read, he heard the echo of English phrases from that French church. He saw candlelight flickering on American faces. He smelled the mixture of gun oil, sweat, and incense. He thought of Sergeant Miller, fists clenched in the pew, trying to decide whether to walk out or stay. He thought of the chaplain's question, do we want to carry a war in our hearts forever? For Franz, the answer slowly became no. It happened in tiny increments. In his bunk, late at night, when he realized he no longer flinched at every shouted order in English. In the work details, when an American guard corrected his pronunciation of a word, then laughed with him instead of at him. In letters from home, months later, describing cities in ruins and a country trying to figure out how to be something other than what it had been. Years later, when he stood in front of a small congregation in a rebuilt German town, collar stiff around his neck, Bible in his hand, he would think back to that night. He would tell his parishioners about the war, sometimes. About hunger and fear and marchers. Through snow. He would rarely talk about battles. He would often talk about a ruined church in France where, for 1 hour, Americans and Germans sang the same hymn. On the other side of the ocean, in a quiet American town, an older James Carter would sometimes find himself in the church he'd been assigned to. After the war, he'd look out over the pews and see faces lit by candlelight. Children fidgeting in their Christmas best, old men leaning on canes, young couples holding hands. he'd read the familiar words again, peace on earth. And he'd remember a night when saying those words meant standing between men who had good reasons to hate each other, and asking them to try not to. The military would never issue a report about that. History books would give it a line at best, but in the invisible ledger where wars are, measured not just in dead and wounded, but in what is salvaged from the wreckage. That open church door had weight. In the end, the war did what wars do. Lines moved. Flags changed. Men went home or didn't. Barbed wire came down. Churches were rebuilt. New enemies replaced old ones in speeches and on maps. But some things lingered. A hymn in 2 languages, still braided together in a few men's memories. The feel of a wooden pew under a body that had expected cold ground instead. The memory of being invited once, when every instinct had said you deserved to be locked out. If there's one sentence that survives from that winter in 1944, it might be this: sometimes the bravest thing a man can do in a war is open a door, not to let bullets in or out. To let humanity cross a line that uniforms tried to make permanent. For Franz, that open door became the first crack in a hard shell of propaganda and fear. For James, it became proof that his faith was more than words recited over caskets. Years later, when snow fell quietly on German rooftops and American porches, 2 old men might pause and listen to carols drifting through the night, and in that shared, unspoken moment, they would both remember, for 1 hour, in one broken church, they chose not to be enemies. And that choice, small as it was, is the kind that lets the world heal. Subscribe for more true stories that remind us of what it means to be human even in the darkest of times.